guys, welcome back to my channel. Holy shit, it's been a minute. I'm sorry. I apologize. My bad. At first, it was really hard for me to get consistent with posting because I was busy with work and busy with my kids and busy with just trying to kind of keep a good work-life balance. And now I'm laid off. Along with a lot of America, I don't have a job right now, so I have a little bit more free time to be able to do stuff like this. That being said, all 4 of my kids are home with me 24/7. So even though I do have free time, it's not necessarily the most relaxing or productive free time that I have ever had. So that being said, I am back with a new true crime video today. I know it has been like 9 months, I think, since I've done a true crime video. Like, we could have like grown a whole ass baby in the amount of time it's been since I've done a true crime video. So for that, I'm sorry that it's been so long. Thank you guys for hanging in here. Thank you guys for being patient. I've gotten quite a few new subscribers lately, and I feel like they are probably from TikTok. So if you found my YouTube from my TikTok, thank you. Hi, how are you? I'm so glad you're here. If you are a YouTube subscriber and you haven't seen my TikTok yet, I do go suggest you check that out. I have been a lot more active on there lately, and as far as just kind of my day-to-day life and frequent posting, you can find me a little bit more active over on TikTok. So feel free to check me out there if you are into the TikToking. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into today's story. Today's case was one that was suggested quite a few times by a subscriber. So when I came back to doing true crime videos, I wanted to make sure that this was the first case I cover. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the murder of Mandy Lemaire. So Mandy Lemaire was an 11-year-old girl who lived in a small town called Tazlina, Alaska, with her parents and her brothers. Now, Tazlina was a really small town at the time that this all took place. There was approximately 240 residents that lived in Tazlina. So everybody, for the most part, knew everybody. Everyone knew who everyone was. And most people knew who Mandy was. And she had a really good reputation around the town. She was just a really sweet girl. She was a really friendly girl. It was reported that there were times where she would, you know, put on dresses and do her hair and be a little bit more girly when it comes to stuff. But then she wasn't one to hesitate to jump on a 4-wheeler and go out riding, go hunting, go fishing, stuff like that. So she definitely had her little feminine side, but then she could be just kind of a tomboy and be outdoorsy and go hang out with her brothers and do stuff like that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Tazlina was a small town, so everybody knew everyone, and because of this, there was a pretty high level of trust within the community. It was not uncommon for kids to walk like 2 or 3 miles to get from their house to a friend's house. And like I mentioned, Tazlina is in Alaska, so it's a little bit more spread out. It's not like a densely populated state. You're not going to find 10,000 people within a small area. So because of that, people kind of had a false sense of security, like nothing bad was going to happen to any of them. Nothing bad was going to happen to the kids. Unfortunately, on August 22nd of 1991, the small town of Tazlina, Alaska, learned that it was not as safe as a town as they thought it was. So on August 22nd of the year 1991, Mandy and her friend April were hanging out, and they decided to go meet up with some other kids. So they started off on their 1 or 2 mile walk to their friend's house, and part of the way there, April fell down. She skinned her knee. She got hurt. It wasn't like a serious injury or anything bad. If it was bad enough to where she did want to walk back to the store really quick, get some stuff, get cleaned up, bandage it up, and then go on to their friend's house from there. So the plan was that April was going to go back, get bandaged up, go meet back up with Mandy, and then they were going to continue on together to their friend's house. Now, this was the plan. Unfortunately, this is not the way that things happened. As April was coming back from getting her knee bandaged up, she noticed that she did not see Mandy where she had left her. She couldn't find her there. So at first she wasn't overly worried. She thought maybe she just wandered off ahead of me and she went and met up with her friends and I'll be able to see her there. Or maybe she's hiding and she's just playing a joke on me. You know, something was definitely a little bit weird, but nobody was overly worried at this point in time. So after April looked around for a little bit, she realized, I cannot find Mandy. I don't know where she is. And at this point, she decided to go back to Mandy's family and let them know what had happened. Now, Mandy's family was obviously a little bit more concerned at this point. So they decided to go around and just kind of look in their area, have neighbors go look in their areas, and just kind of do a quick sweep through to see if anybody could locate Mandy and see where she was at. However, after the neighbors had looked for a little bit, they realized they did not know where she was. And at this point, the authorities were contacted and the police showed up, and it became like an actual missing person investigation at this point in time. So after Mandy's disappearance, the whole community really came together to look for her. There were approximately 75 to 100 different volunteers who came out from the neighborhoods to look for her. There were people up in the sky in helicopters who were looking for her. There were people on the grounds who were looking for her. There were people with scent tracking dogs who were looking for her. Everybody was doing the best job that they could to try to find this girl, to try to locate her, to try to bring her back home safely, and to try to just figure out what had happened to her. Now, because this was a little bit more of a kind of wilderness environment, there were a lot of different theories as to what could have happened to her, starting with something like a kidnapping, which is just really, really scary and is obviously the worst thing that you would possibly want to think of, all the way up to something like a grizzly bear attack, which doesn't seem very likely, but when you're out in the wilderness, anything could happen. And when you're missing a child, the possibilities are endless as to where they could be. So for 10 days, Mandy Lemaire's family and community and neighborhood and friends were just left wondering, what happened to her? Where did she go? Did someone take her? Did something get a hold of her? Did she wander off and get lost? What happened? And 10 days after she went missing, everybody got their answer as to what happened to Mandy Lemaire. Unfortunately, 10 days after she had gone missing, Mandy Lemaire's body was found in a wooded area about a mile from her house by people who were searching the area. Now, their first thought, is maybe that she had wandered off and something had happened to her and the elements had taken her. However, upon closer investigation, it was apparent that Mandy Lemaire, a beautiful, sweet, innocent 11-year-old girl, had been murdered. There were 2 bullet wounds to her, so they could tell that she had been shot 2 times at close range with a .22 rifle and then just left out in the forest to be discovered, which is just, it's really, really tragic and it's really, really sad. Now, once Mandy's body was discovered, obviously the authorities just started a frantic investigation into the area her body was discovered at to see if there was any physical evidence that they could find at all, any footprints, any tire prints, any hairs, any pieces of clothing, just anything that could have been left behind, so that they would have a starting point to figure out who could have done this to Mandy. Now, this was complicated by the fact that in the days shortly before Mandy was discovered, there was a lot of really heavy rainfall. And when you get heavy rainfall in areas that are heavily wooded, it just causes a lot of stuff to shift. It causes a lot of stuff to move. It causes mud to be washed away. So any tire prints that there would have been were gone. Any footprints that there would have been were gone. And it left the authorities just feeling kind of defeated at first, that there wasn't any physical anything for them to find. But then once they started to look a little bit closer, they were able to find a couple crucial pieces of physical evidence that helped authorities in this case. And that evidence was discovered upon closer investigation of Mandy Lemaire herself. Now, when authorities were searching Mandy Lemaire's body, doing her autopsy, things like that, there were indicators that she had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered, which made it even harder for the family to kind of hear and deal with, because that just adds an extra layer of hurt onto everything. But it also adds an extra layer of motive onto everything, and this was something that was helpful for authorities later on. In addition, authorities were able to look at Mandy Lemaire's fingernails, and they could see just so much dirt under her nails, and they could tell that her nails had been broken away. So what this showed was that she was not like murdered at a prior location and then dumped in the woods. It showed that she was shot where she was discovered, and that she was fighting really, really hard for her life and to try to get away, and that she fought up until the last possible minute until she could not fight anymore. Other things that were found on her person that will end up being very important later were fibers from different pieces of fabric, paint chips, and some little metal flakes that were found on her clothing and her hair, things like that. All of those were discovered by authorities, and later on you'll see are very, very important pieces of evidence. Now, upon initial investigation, Authorities were originally suspicious of a man named Dave Deforest. Now, Dave Deforest was the kind of guy who just talked about things a little too much to where it got suspicious. Anytime he would have any conversations with his friends, he would bring up Mandy's murder. Anytime he'd be talking about anything with anyone really, he would be bringing up Mandy's murder. And he almost just seemed, his friend says, obsessed with the case. And anytime somebody has a high level of interest in the case, that's obviously going to make them a suspect. However, upon further investigation by police, once they talked to him, they were able to figure out that Dave Deforest actually did have a solid alibi for the day of Mandy's disappearance and murder, so he was not involved in it. However, he did have an important piece of information for the authorities, and that was the name of a 61-year-old man named Charles Smithart. Now, apparently, according to Dave Deforest, he had seen Smithart driving in his truck up and down the road that Mandy Lemaire went missing from at approximately the same time she went missing on the same day that she went missing. Now, it was at this point that the authorities started to kind of direct their attention towards Charles Smithart and to look into him a little bit more. And at that point, there were things that started to come to surface about him that looked a little suspicious. Now, prior to all of this happening, Smithart had a pretty good reputation. He was really friendly with the kids in the neighborhood. He would fix their bikes. He would give them candy. He would give them rides to places if he saw them walking down the street. And when you're not looking at this with suspicious eyes, all of those just seem like, relatively nice things for someone to do in a community. However, when you look at it as an involvement in a possible child abduction, that shows that he is somebody who could have obtained trust of younger children and then taken advantage of it for his own purpose and his own gain and his own benefit later on. Now, another thing that authorities thought was a little bit weird was that it turns out that Charles Smithart had actually helped look for Mandy. Now, he did not sign in on any of the official rosters. He didn't want people to know he was there. He didn't want his name attached to the searches. However, when they went back through and they looked at who was involved in searching for Mandy Lemaire, it turns out Charles Smithart was there. And again, this was another pretty crucial piece of evidence to police because it is not uncommon for people who commit crimes to go back to the scene of the murder so that they can watch people's reaction, they can watch the body be discovered, they can watch the family have reactions. I don't know exactly what the psychology of it is, but it is not uncommon for criminals to return back to the scene of the crime and to kind of try to be involved in the case. Now, at first, when police talked to Charles Smithart, he completely denied any involvement in this whatsoever. He said that he had an alibi. He was at home with his mom all day that day. They were just hanging out and watching TV, but there's no way he could have killed Mandy Lemaire. And his mom backed up that alibi. However, it was discovered upon kind of deeper investigation and looking into stuff that they were able to find out that Charles Smithart's mom went to the store for a little bit that day. This was tracked with security cameras. This was tracked with receipts with her banking information on it that came from a store that had timestamps on it. So even though Smithart had tried to say he had a rock solid alibi and that he could not have done this, it turns out he could have, and that there was a long enough time period in the day where Smithart's mom was gone that he was left unattended and he was left without an alibi. And this caused the police to look into him a little bit more and to start doing things like getting warrants and kind of taking that next step in the investigation process. Now, upon initial investigation of his house, his car, just the surrounding areas, his personal property, the police were able to find a few things that really started to make Charles Smithart look bad. And those things are the pieces of physical evidence that I talked about that were found on Mandy earlier. There were yellow paint chips, there were fibers of fabric, and there were these kind of weird metal flakes that were found both on Smithart's person and also in his house. And it was discovered that those metal flakes were from when he was cutting metal in his workshop. So the flakes were in the workshop. They were on his clothes from where they'd kick back when he was cutting. They were in his car from when he would sit in his car, and then they were also found on Mandy Lemaire's body, which showed that at one point she was in his car with him. And these weren't just like metal flakes that could have been found anywhere. They were a lot more specific and just kind of unique, and they could identify that they had all been the same metal, the same cut, and that the flakes and fibers and everything that were found on Mandy Lemaire absolutely came from Charles Smithart's shed. And this showed that he was probably involved. At this point, the physical evidence was really starting to stack up against Charles Smithart and was starting to make him look very, very guilty. Now, the final nail in the coffin came when investigators went to talk to Charles Smithart's family. And Charles Smithart's oldest daughter was willing to talk, and what she said was pretty damning. It turns out that Charles Smithart used to sexually abuse his daughters, and the sexual abuse started at the age of 11, which is the age that Mandy was when she was murdered. So again, with the proof of the sexual assault on Mandy's body, going back to the fact that Charles Smithart would sexually assault his own children, combined with the physical evidence of what they had in his car, in his workshop, and on him and on Mandy, the police were pretty sure that they had their guy, and they knew exactly who did this. And it was being made very clear that Charles Smithart was not just some 60-something-year-old sweet old man who would help these kids out of the goodness of his heart. He was truly a monster who had very different alternative reasons for helping these children. And he was capable of committing horrific, horrible acts. So at this point, police were convinced that they had their man, and Charles Smithart was arrested, and he was charged with the kidnapping and death of Mandy Lemaire. In 1993, Charles Smithart went to court to face the charges of first-degree kidnapping, first-degree sexual battery of a minor, and first-degree murder. For these charges, Charles Smithart was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 114 years in prison, which would have been the rest of his life. Now, at this point, the Lemaire family should have felt justice. They should have felt like, you know, they were able to catch the man who murdered their daughter, and they should have felt a little bit of closure. However, in the year 1999, Charles Smithart's legal team argued that they were not given a fair chance to show Dave Deforest's involvement in the case. They were still saying that Charles Smithart was innocent, and they were trying to prove that Dave Deforest was the man who had killed Mandy Lemaire. And this actually made it so that Charles Smithart's first trial was declared a mistrial. Now, Smithart never made it to his second trial. He died in prison in the year 2000 from lung cancer while he was awaiting his second trial. You know, so I mean, he did serve the rest of his life in prison, and that was a good thing. It's just, it sucks that the charges were dropped at the end, and that ultimately he died without having to carry that guilty verdict with him, which I don't know if it really makes a difference at the end of the day, but it just doesn't seem right or fair. So yeah, that's it for today's case. I am so happy to be back in front of the camera. I am so happy to be filming with you guys. I would imagine I should hopefully start getting these up a little bit more regularly now. Thank you guys for giving me a little bit of your time out of your day. You really didn't have to do that, and you did, and I just think that's really awesome. So thank you so much. Make sure you are following me on my social medias if you are not. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Just search Eponine, aka Epi, and I will pop up there. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up, like, and subscribe so you can come back for more stuff later. And yeah, that is it. I love you all so much. Thank you very, very much for joining me today, and we'll touch base soon. Bye.